بەیانیتان باش لە سێمین ڕۆژی کۆنگرەی نێودەوڵەتی مەولانا خالیدی نەقەشبەندی دانیشتنی ئەم سەر لە بەیانیە پانێڵی هەشتەمە بە بەشداری بەڕێزان مارتن ڤان برونسن بابەتەکەی بەناوی مەولانا خالید و دەسەڵاتی ئاینی بۆماوەیی لە کوردستاندا، میشێل لەزنبەرگ شیکردنەوەی دەقێکی مەولانا خالید عەقیدەت الئیمان، فەرهاد شاکەلی شێخ سراجەدینی نەقشبەندی 1780 بۆ 1866، ئەلکساندەر پاپاز مەوجودیە لە ئاسیایی ناوەڕاستی چینی لە زەمەنی مەولانا خالیددا، بەڕێوەبەری پانێڵیش بەڕێز کاک فریاد ڕەواندوزیە با جەنابیان بفەرمێ بۆ پێشکەشکردن و بەڕێوەبردننی پانێڵەکە.
بەیانیتان باش. پانێڵی هەشتەمی ئەمڕۆ لە چوار پانێڵستی بەڕێز پێکاتووە کە دەربارەی چەندین بابەتی جیاجیا قسە لەسەر بابەتەکانیان ئەەکەن. یەکەم بەشداربوو مارتن ڤان برۆنسنە. هەمووتان ڕەنگە ئاشنا بن بە ناوی مارتن ڤان برۆنسن لەبەرەوەی ناوێکی دیارە، بەتایبەتی بەهۆی کتابە بەناوبانگەکەی کە تەرجەمە کراوە بۆ چەندین زمان لەوانە زمانی کوردی و عەرەبی بە ناونیشانی ئاغا شێخ و دەوڵەت. ئەگەرچی خۆی فیزیای تیۆری و ماتماتیکی خوێندووە لە زانکۆی ئۆترێخت، بەڵام لێکۆڵی مەیدانیەکانی لە سەر دین، ئیسلام، تەسەووف و هەروەها ماوەیەکی زۆریش کە لە ئەندەنوسیا بووە و لەسەر لقەکانی ئیسلام لە ئەندەنوسیا توانیەتی چەندین لۆکۆڵۆنیەوە و هەروەها 6 کتاب بەچاپ بگێنێ بۆتە هۆی ئەوەی کە ببێتە یەکێک لە کەسە هەرە ناسراوەکان لە نووسین دەربارەی زمان و ئاین و تەسەووف و هەروەها ئیسلام و لقەکانی ئیسلام. بابەتەکەی بە ناونیشانی مەولانا خالید و دەسەڵاتی ئاینی میراتی یان بۆماوەیی لە کوردستاندا با بەڕێز مارتن ڤان برۆنسن بفەرمێت.
Good morning. About 50 years ago, when I was a young man and I started my study of Kurdish society, I tried to find an answer to the question why in the beginnings of Kurdish nationalism as a popular movement, we saw rebellions led by tariqat sheikhs, beginning with Sheikh Ubaidullah until Sheikh Said of Palu. The uprisings, which had a somewhat nationalistic character, were led by Sufi sheikhs. I tried to understand why Sufi sheikhs could play such a political role. And among the answers, I found the place of Maulana Khalid. Some of you may have read my Agha Sheikh and State, where I set out the argument that Maulana Khalid established a wide network of khalifas all over Kurdistan and thereby integrating Kurdistan across all the tribes and the different regions and the different dialects of Kurdistan. And that his khalifas, again established many khalifas, made the network even denser. And that at the same time we see the arrival of British imperialism, the impacts of British imperialism in the region, and of administrative reform in the Ottoman Empire. The last Kurdish emirates are abolished. And almost automatically, the tariqat sheikhs, and mostly Naqshbandi sheikhs, adopt the role of political leaders with an authority that can transcend all the different tribal differences. Well, today I want to take a look at the same process but from a different angle, and I want to focus on a different question. I'm not going to talk about Qadiri and Naqshbandi so much, but more about hereditary religious authority. We find in Kurdistan many religious leaders who have this role as religious leaders from their father or uncle, and who had it from another ancestor, and so on. Aban Anjad, as the Arabs say. Hereditary authority. I had not been aware at the time when I did my research of the ambivalence of authority. Later I read the study by Ziya Gökalp, written about 100 years ago. Ziya Gökalp wrote about Kurdish tribes, and he compared Kurdish tribes with Arab tribes, and he said there's a very important difference. In the Arab tribe, the Agha of the tribe is a relative of all the other members. In fact, he is the eldest son, usually of the eldest son, of the eldest son, of the eldest son, of the eldest son, and so on, of the common ancestor of the tribe. Among the Kurds, you have small tribes where, again, the Agha is a relative of the members of the tribe. But in most large Kurdish tribes, the Agha claims that his ancestors are outsiders. The Aghas claim that they descend from Arab conquerors like Khalid ibn Walid or Salahuddin Ayyubi, or Iranian kings like the Sassanians. In the Sharafname, if you read the Sharafname, you see that almost all the families of emirs claim descent not from Kurds, but from Persians or from Arabs. We see the same with religious leadership. Many people of religious authority in Kurdistan claim descent from prestigious non-Kurdish ancestors, in many cases the Prophet and the Imams. This is most clearly so in the so-called heterodox religious communities, among the Kakai, the Yazidis, the Alevis of Turkey, where you find that the religious leaders belong to specific families. Kakais have Khandan, the Alevis call them Ojak. Those are families that are the ritual leaders of the community. You cannot live as an Alevi and practice your religion without a relationship with these leaders. And these families are like a different caste living among the commoners of the Yazidis, the Alevis, and the Kakais. Now, interestingly, although nowadays these groups consider themselves as rather different from Islam, the ancestors of these Ojaks and Khanadans, of these families of religious authorities, all claim descent from either from the Imams or from other major Arab Muslim leaders. As you know, the peers of the Yazidis are families that descend from Sheikh Adi bin Musafir, who himself descended from the Umayyads. The Pir and Sayyids of the Kakai descend, the most important Khanadans descend from Sayyid Isa, sometimes called Sayyid Isa Nurbakhsh, who is also believed to be the ancestor of the Barzanji family. And in the case of the Alevis, the most important Alevi religious families claim descent from a Sayyid named Sayyid Abul Wafa Taj al-Arifin, who lived around the year 1100, and who is known from other Arabic sources as a Sunni, an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. Yazidis, Kakais and Alawis resemble in many respects a Sufi order, a tariqa. But there are two important differences. In a tariqa, everyone can become a member of the tariqa after a process of learning and bay'ah. But an outsider cannot become a member of the Yazidis, the Alawis, or the Kakais. You are born in the community. It is a closed community. Similarly, religious leaders in these communities cannot, no one, however clever he is, however important a new intellectual representative community is, he cannot become a religious leader. Religious leaders have to come from these specific families. So I always thought that's a major difference between these communities and the Sunni Muslims. But then later, I started realizing that, in fact, among the Sunni Kurds, you find something quite similar. There is a small number of large families claiming descent from the Prophet, the Sayyid families, that have for many centuries provided religious and spiritual guidance, as well as religious teaching of the Sharia, to broad segments of Kurdish society. The best known of these families, of course, are the Barzinjis, and I think we have talked a lot about the Barzinjis these days. I shall not go deeply into that. All present branches of the Barzinjis appear to descend from Baba Rasul Gawre, who lived in the early 17th century. The family itself has its shajara, they know their ancestry, but they are not mentioned in outside sources as far as I am. I have to be modest. I may not have read all the relevant sources, but I have never come across references to Barzinjis before the 17th century. They must have lived here for a long time, but we find many Kurdish ulama mentioned in the sources, but none of them was a Barzinji. It is only with Muhammad bin Abdul Rasul Barzinji, who becomes one of the leading ulama of Medina, that we find that the Barzinji became a more and more prominent religious family of ulama, not only in Kurdistan, but internationally. So this is the 17th century, which seems to be a turning point. There were Kurdish ulama, but it's a family of hereditary leaders, the Barzinjis, who become more visible in our sources in the 17th century. Around the same time, in northern Kurdistan, we find another family of Sayyid, sometimes called the Urmawi sheikhs, the sheikhs from Urmia. Originally, their family lived in Badamyar, which is to the east of Lake Urmia, which is close to close to Maragha and Tabriz. But when the Safavids emerged, they first fled to Urmia, and from Urmia they moved to the Ottoman Empire. The most famous member of the family, Sheikh Aziz Mahmud, was, according to Ottoman sources, in the 17th century, the most influential sheikh of all of Kurdistan. One historian writes, all the Kurds are followers of Sheikh Aziz Mahmud, or his brother, or his father. This family has authority over all of Kurdistan. And the historians write that they are hereditary sheikhs. In the sheikhs of the Naqshbandiya. In the Naqshbandiya, until that time, sheikhhood was not hereditary. A sheikh appointed his successor, and the successor was the most learned, the most spiritually gifted of his disciples. But with the Urmawi sheikhs, we find that suddenly sheikhhood becomes hereditary. Sheikh Aziz Mahmud was executed by the Sultan because of his growing influence. The Sultan was afraid he might lead a Mahdist rebellion. People said he's going to be a Mahdi. But his family remained important for several generations, and then our sources don't mention them again. Until very recently, the family of the famous Sheikh Said started claiming that they descend from these same sheikhs, the Umayyad sheikhs. And I will come back briefly to that family. There is a third, a better known to you, family of hereditary authorities, the Gilanizadeh, or the Sayyids of Nehri. That family again becomes prominent rather late. They claim to be descended from Sayyid Abdul Aziz Gilani, the son of Sheikh Abdul Qadir, who is buried in Accra. So you would imagine they have been here at least for almost 1,000 years. But they are only mentioned in the sources in the 19th century. Perhaps a little bit, perhaps in the late 18th century. And that is the moment when the family established itself in Nehri. A fourth family in northern Kurdistan are the Arwasis, also Sayyids. They claim they had moved from Baghdad after the conquest by the Mongols, that is in 1258, and settled in the area south of Lake One. But they only become known as ulama rather late. The first instance that I have found is in the 18th century. So that raises a question. Sayyids have been here all along, but there is a certain period in time when they become prominent as the most important of the ulama, and they seem to displace the non-Sayyid ulama. And I think there may be a relationship with the patronage by the Emirates, but I cannot prove that. There is another possible explanation why these families become so prominent and why authority is hereditary in their families. A Sufi sheikh in Kurdish tribal society is expected to do many things. He teaches fiqh, he teaches the practices of the tariqah, but for the non-educated people, he plays many other roles. For the common people, he becomes a healer, a miracle worker, a supernatural protector, an intermediary between this world and the next. There is a saying, who does not have a sheikh, his sheikh is Satan. That reflects a widespread attitude of common people towards the sheikh, a feeling of complete dependence for salvation on a sheikh. Entire communities attach themselves to charismatic sheikhs. And when the sheikh dies, it is rather obvious in a tribal society that they flock automatically to his descendants. So it is the veneration of the common people that makes religious leadership hereditary. Now, I think this is the situation that Mawlana confronted when he entered Kurdistan. As Halkaut Hakim cites in his dissertation, he said when Abdullah Dehlavi sends him to the Ottoman Empire, he said, but there are these great families, there are the Barzinjis, there are the Haidaris, and so on. How can I? But he goes and he takes on the grand families. So, from one point of view, Mawlana Khalid's intervention in Kurdish society is in fact a challenge to the established authorities in single families. And he appoints as his khalifas many people who are not Sayyids. Some of his khalifas come from these great families. There are Barzinjis, there are the Sayyids of Nehri, there are later Arwasis among the khalifas of the Naqshbandiya. But most of Mawlana Khalid's khalifas, and the same is true of the khalifas of Sayyid Taha of Nehri, of Khalid Jazari, of Ahmad Khatib al-Arbili, most of their khalifas are common people, they're not Sayyids. So in a way, we see a democratization, if I may use that word, of religious authority, of the authority of the sheikh. Mawlana's intervention seems to challenge the principle of hereditary religious authority, but Mawlana Khalid failed. He succeeded briefly, but then he died too early. He did not appoint a real successor. So this network of the Naqshbandis did not have a natural center anymore. Some people considered Mahmud Saib, his brother, to be the leader, but very soon there were conflicts between different families claiming the role of the central leader. And we see that every Khalifa prefers then to appoint a relative as his successor. So what we get instead of Kurdistan with only 4 big Sayyid families, now we have a Kurdistan with dozens of Naqshbandi families with the same principle of hereditary authority. I think these are the main points that I wanted to make. I also want to make a disclaimer. This is to some extent speculative. I'm not 100% sure of everything I say, but I think it is perhaps an interesting hypothesis to think with, to see Mawlana as someone who challenges the existing system of authority in the region. He shakes it up.
Mr. Martin, you have 5 minutes left.
Yes, well, I need perhaps 1 minute.
Sure.
And let me read my conclusion. In the few years between his return from India and his move from Baghdad to Damascus, Mawlana Khalid shook up the system of religious authority in Kurdistan, and to some extent, more widely in the entire Ottoman Empire. This system had been dominated by a very small number of families of sheikhs, most of which were affiliated with the Qadiriyya. Mawlana Khalid and the Naqshbandiya Khalidiyya emancipated an entire generation of learned and gifted men of religion who hailed from more common backgrounds and connected them in a social network that spread all over Kurdistan. The gradual modernization of the Ottoman administration and increasing interference by European powers in the affairs of the empires caused a backlash in which Muslim religious authorities could also strengthen their political influence. The Naqshbandi network only remained centralized and united as long as Mawlana Khalid was alive. A generation later, we find that the new Naqshbandi authorities were also turning to dynastic succession, keeping authority and influence within the family. The number of Sheikhly dynasties had, however, become much more numerous than it had been before the arrival of Mawlana Khalid. So that at the time of Sheikh Said's rebellion, Sheikh Said, exasperated at the reluctance of some of his colleagues to participate in the uprising, complains to his friends, this Shah-e-Naqshband established a Shirkatiki gangster in Kurdistan, which is one of the quotations that I had from Mullah Hussein Hushar, who had been at Sheikh Said's side. Even Sheikh Said complained about the change of this network of authority in which the individual sheikhs were focused very much on their own dynasty and no longer on the wider interest. Thank you. I will be very interested to hear critical comments. And if you can't comment now, perhaps you can write to me with critique of additional information, because this is something I'm just still thinking about, and it's ideas that I'm still developing. Thank you for your attention.
زۆر سوپاس. بابەتەکەی زیاتر دەربارەی گواستنەوەی سەرکردایەتی بنەماڵەکان بوو لە باب و باپیران بۆ کوڕکانیان، و هەروەها هەندێک لەو سەرکردە ئاینیانە کە چۆن خۆیان بە نەسەبەوە ئەگەینە ئەسحابە و سەید و مەلا و هەروەها دەوروبەری ماڵی پێغەمبەر، کامەیەکێکە لە خاڵە ناکۆکەکان لەلایەن لێکۆڵەرەکانی کورد، چونکە زۆربەی زۆری ئەو کەسانی کە بەم شێوەیەکەن بۆ ئەوەیە کە تەسیر و کاریگەریەکان زیاتر بێت، و هەروەها باسی کاریگەری ئەم خانەوادانەیان کرد لە هەموو کوردستان. زۆر سپاس.